Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ravenstar's Witching Hour. I'm your host and head witch, Miss Dolores Blue Raven, at the helm this evening. I want to give a shout out to everybody at Revolution Radio, staff, producers, listeners, chat room, and thank everyone for tuning in tonight. And we are 100% listener supported, so if you like what you're hearing, please click on the donate button. We appreciate your support and thank you for any contribution you can make to this excellent station. And you are listening to Studio A, and my special guest this evening is Mark Leslie. And Mark Leslie is a Canadian author of horror and speculative fiction. He is the author of the short story collection One Hand Screaming, a collection of short stories and poetry, mostly in the horror genre, and the editor of the science fiction anthology North of Infinity 2 and horror anthology Campus Chills. Mark is also the author of Haunted Hamilton, The Ghosts of Dundurn Castle and Other Steeltown Shivers, and Spooky Sudbury, True Tales of the Eerie and Unexplained, co-authored with Jenny Jellin. And his website is www.markleslie.ca. And please welcome Mark to the show this evening. Mark, how are you?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing fine, thank you, and welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on, and I know you've had a long journey getting to your destination tonight, so I appreciate you being here.
But that was a journey well worth it. I'm really looking forward to this.
Oh, great. Excellent. I don't know if you want to fill people in on where you've been, but...
I was at a fellow author's book launch, a murder mystery about an Elvis escape artist, Melissa Yee, actually. And it was a book. It's called Terminally Ill, and it's about an Elvis escape artist who ends up not being able to get out of the coffin and has to be revived, brought back to life, and then they're trying to figure out who was trying to sabotage his escape artist plans. And it was a lot of fun. So I got to dance to Jailhouse Rock in an Elvis costume, get chained up and put in a coffin as we reenacted the opening scene from the novel.
Cool. That sounds like a blast.
Yeah, it was a different book launch, so it was well worth the 6-hour drive.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I appreciate you being back here and snow and all. So thank you very much, and welcome. And I'd like to talk some ghost stories with you tonight.
And this is the perfect time of day to do it, isn't it?
That's right. It is the witching hour, and there's mist all around my house tonight. And I think you said you had a little bit of snow.
A little bit of snow, and it's just one of those eerie evenings.
I agree. Yeah, it was like that. It was really, really silent outside when I was wandering around my house with my dog. But to get involved, let's talk about your writing a little bit and how you got involved in writing about these haunted areas and what attracted you to that.
I think I was in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Ottawa is the nation's capital here in Canada, and it must have been in the early 90s. And my wife and I had gone on a ghost walk that started on Spark Street in Ottawa. And like many ghost walks, the tour guide was dressed in Victorian garb, had a wonderful lantern, and was speaking in like Victorian English with a British accent, and it was very atmospheric and wonderful. And they took us on a 45-minute walking tour of the downtown area. It was around 10 o'clock at night, and I was fascinated by the ghosts, which I had always been attracted to spooky, scary stories. But the thing that kind of surprised me was how interested I became in the history. Because you can't talk about ghosts without talking about the history. And a lot of the buildings and things that had happened in certain time periods, they all come together. And for the first time ever, history became exciting and fun for me. And when I moved to Hamilton, which is just about an hour outside of Toronto, and I had gone on the Haunted Hamilton ghost walks, and I discovered the same sort of thing. And when I was talking to the owners, after going on a couple of their tours, I'd mentioned, you guys have such great stories. Have you ever thought about doing a book? And they said, well, yeah, we had. We just have never had time to do one. And I said, well, I'd love to do one if you guys are willing to spend some more time with me. And that was basically how I pitched the book to Dundurn Press. I guess it was late 2011 when I pitched the book. And I sat down with Daniel and Stephanie, and they opened up their files. They had 10 years of research.
Wow.
And I spent so much time having lunch and dinner with them and chatting and going on the tours again. And instead of just enjoying the tours, which is always fun, I went with a recorder and I went with notebooks and scared myself silly because I'm the biggest chicken you'll ever find.
That's great.
Yeah, that's sort of how that started. So Haunted Hamilton came out in 2012, and that was my first nonfiction paranormal exploration.
Hmm. Awesome. And what are the main characters in these scenarios with these ghosts? I mean, what really stands out with Haunted Hamilton?
Well, I think Dundurn Castle is a significant historical building in Hamilton, and it was at the time that it was built. There was the one main road coming into Hamilton, and Sir Alan McNabb, who had owned it, had put it up there as sort of a sign of prestige that anyone who came around the bay from Burlington to Hamilton would see this beautiful, glorious mansion. And even though that's not the main road into town now, because there's a highway that goes beyond that, it still is as a significant element. But the interesting thing that I liked about that was that the people who run Dundurn Castle, the historical site, are very leery about talking about ghosts. And so even though that was, the main feature, because Dundurn Castle is a well-known historical element in the city, the people who run it are not happy to have it associated with ghosts. There is a connection to the royal family, Charles and I'm drawing a blank on the name of his new wife. I can't remember her name now. The Prince Charles and
Diana? No.
After Diana died, then he married, what was her name?
Oh, right.
I can't remember.
Right. I forget too. Anybody want to
Shame
text
on
us?
me. Whoever, Prince Charles and his companion.
Right. Okay.
But they were actually here about 5 years ago at Dundurn Castle, because there's an association between the castle and the royal family. So there's a very prestigious. But I think the War of 1812, because we're about 45 minutes from the U.S. border, and so there's a lot of tales about the War of 1812. Because when you have a war, you have a lot of people die, and when you have a lot of people die, you may have some spirits who are at unrest, and so I think a lot of the spirits in Haunted Hamilton are spirits from that time period, from the War of 1812.
Mm-hmm. That's very eerie. And have you actually experienced these ghosts yourself?
I have not met a ghost yet, and maybe that's a good thing, because I am a gigantic chicken. I remember when I was working on Haunted Hamilton, even last night when I was in a hotel room working on Tomes of Terror, my new book about haunted bookstores and libraries. I worked till about 1 a.m. on it, and there was a certain point where I was working, I was doing the research, I was talking about this ghost in a castle, and I think it was in, oh God, was it in Denver? I'm trying to remember. There's so many different ghosts in so many different locations. And as I finished writing the chapter and combining the research, and I get to the end of the chapter, I got really, really excited. And then I just realized I'm by myself, and it's 1 a.m. and I'm in a hotel room far away from home, and it's dark out. And I just got this shiver down my spine. And I always do that to myself when I'm writing these sorts of stories.
That's really funny, because you also write horror, so that's kind of interesting. Do you spook yourself with that too?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that attracts me to when I want to write horror is I write about the things that scare me, or the things that frighten me. And so most of the stories that I've written, the fiction stories, are in many ways an exploration of my own fears. And maybe it's therapy, or maybe it's just that sort of roller coaster thrill that I get from, because when I write the story, I commit myself to the scene. I'm in the scene. I'm with the characters. I'm experiencing the terror, and to me that's the important element of it, is immersing yourself in that emotion and that fear.
Exactly. And I do want to thank you, Mark Eddy. Her name was Camilla.
Oh, Camilla, yes, thank you.
Appreciate that. Yeah, we both drew a blank with that one. So insofar as the Sudbury goes, I know let's see here. Let's talk a little bit about. Yeah, let's talk about Sudbury for a little bit. I wanted to talk a little bit about the mines, which I'm really attracted to, and I found that to be very interesting. And I was wondering what your take is on that. I mean, I know that it was supposedly there were a lot of miners that supposedly lost their lives and supposedly haunt the place. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I grew up in just north of Sudbury, about a 45-minute drive in a small town, and the haunted mine is actually in the small town of 2,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, in a mining community, there is tragedy. I mean, there's a lot of safety and there's a lot of time that goes without any accident. But when an accident happens in a mine or in an industrial environment, they tend to be very, very serious and usually are life and death situations. So there have been miners who have died. Unfortunately, in the mines, the story in that one, which is the haunted level of Levack mine, the 2650 level, and that's I guess that's how many feet down it is from the surface. Have you ever been in a cave or a mine?
I've been in, I've been underground. Yeah.
So you know that it's darker than dark. It's I've been down. I was actually at that level. Thank God when I was at that level it was probably 20 years ago, my uncle who worked at the mine took my cousin and I down. Thank God I didn't know about this ghost story because I would not have gone down there. But it is an eerie experience because you are removed from light. You are removed from safety. You are isolated in the dark, in the cold. There's echoes. You hear water dripping. I mean, it is a really, really eerie experience. And my uncle, when we were down there on a tour with my cousin, he turned the lights off, turned off the lights on our helmets. And it was really freaky. Claustrophobia. So combine all of these natural fears that many of us have with seeing these eyes staring back at you from the darkness. And you can kind of put yourself in the shoes of this the miner who was there. And it was back in the day when there weren't Sunday shifts. They were basically just patrolling the mines and making sure that all the machinery was operational. So there's basically 3 people on site. One of them is down in the depths of the mine by himself, and he sees these eyes glaring out at him from the dark. And it takes a good 15 to 20 minutes for him to get back up to the surface. It's not like you can just run because you can't climb up the shaft. You have to wait for the elevator to get down and then bring you back up. And it's not like an elevator in New York City skyscraper. This is a slow, steady elevator. And I can only imagine the terror that he felt in that slow climb. And of course, he never he refused to ever go underground again, and that was his last time.
Wow, that's so interesting. And was there any theories about what that was? I mean, was it a real ghost or was it something else?
There's, of course, there are lots of rumors about, it could be this person's ghost or that person's ghost. But one of the theories that probably is the most popular theory is that these trucks would go down or train cars would go down with lumber, and this would be the lumber that they would use to build the underground railroad tracks that would haul the ore back and forth underground, because there's miles and miles of underground pathways, and sometimes animals would be in the lumber, like a raccoon, for example, could be in the lumber. And so when that got sent down, it was possible that what he was seeing was the light from his helmet was reflecting off of the eyes of some nocturnal creature, like a raccoon. And that could have looked like glowing eyes in the dark, scared him enough. And that was it. Nobody knows for sure what it is that he saw. He swears it was a ghost. Some people say it was probably some sort of animal, but that was enough for him to not want to go back into the mine.
Right. It's not the first time I've heard stories about people going into caves and things and experiencing something that appears paranormal. So it's highly possible. And it seems to me like you were talking about how many miners lost their lives. Any idea insofar as how many really transferred out in that area?
When I looked at the history of the Levack mine, and it was quite an extensive history, actually, I picked up a book. Actually, the miner who I sat down with Hans, he was a retired miner who has written the history of the Levack mine, and so he was the one who relayed the stories to me. I think there were probably less than 50 deaths in the history of the mine.
Mm-hmm.
It could have been even less than 40, which is pretty significant when you think about how dangerous a mine is. And oftentimes, I know when I was about, I think it was about 15 years old, there was a major accident, and it had been 15 or 20 years since there had been an accident, and there were 4 miners who were killed when they were on a certain level, and the rock was supposed to dump from one level down to another, and one of the chutes was open instead of closed, and it was supposed to be closed and divert the rocks into a slot, and unfortunately it went into the area where the men were, and they were killed instantly.
Wow. Yeah, I'm sure that leaves some kind of a psychic signature.
Yeah, I remember. It was a pretty. I mean, you hear about mining tragedies in towns, and it's a pretty devastating thing.
Mm-hmm.
The whole town is shaken up. Everybody, because it was a small town as well. I mean, you pretty much knew everybody. Knew the people or knew family members of the people who died. So it's a very emotional and powerful thing. And so when I was writing about the ghost in Spooky Sudbury, I was also trying to be very, very sensitive to the families, and I encountered that when I was writing Haunted Hamilton as well. There was a story about a professor at McMaster who had been murdered in her office, and she had been tied up and brutalized by a student, and it had only happened about 30 years ago, and the story had been shared to me, but I chose not to put it in the book because it was still too close to home. It was still too. I mean, there's one thing to talk about somebody who died, who was hung in the War of 1812, or a soldier that was killed on the battlefield, and quite another to talk about something that's really, really recent. Because you're not doing it to glamorize or to glorify violence or death. You're doing it to talk about the restless spirits that were not ready to leave,
Right.
or that have some unfulfilled desire on this plane, and that's the exploration, rather than it being, like a true crime, study.
Mm-hmm. That makes perfect sense. Yeah, there's a lot of respect, and I appreciate that, and I'm sure everybody else does as well. Yeah. And it's interesting how they, I suspect they've been haunting for some time now. I mean, these apparitions would probably have been there for, would you say, a very long time? Or in and out?
In which
Actually, both. I mean, when you think about Sudbury in general, I mean, do you feel an older presence than what's, say, the miners? Is there something there prior to that energetically?
Yeah, I think the Sudbury Hospital, and it's now a closed hospital. It's actually going to be converted into condominiums now. I think Sudbury has that element with a hospital, because when you think about hospitals, you think about this is a place where people come to die. And people come to be born, or people are born in hospitals and they die in hospitals. So it is a place where people move from one world to the other naturally, and there's a lot of that happening in a hospital. And so when that goes back to when it was used to be known as St. Joseph's, and it was the nuns that ran the hospital, and so there's a huge rich history of life and death on this particular spot on the planet. And so the stories about being in the abandoned hospital as the people were working to demolish parts of the building as they were converting it into condos are the eerie stories about being down in the basement level where the morgue was, of course, and hearing the little girl giggling and hearing the sound of as if she had dropped a bag of marbles on the floor and hearing them echo through the hallway, which seems to be an innocent enough thing, and yet in that setting, in that abandoned hospital, it's one of the eeriest things you can think of.
Right. And when you're writing about all of this, do you feel a presence in your room, or do you ever feel like there are hitchers that connect in with you and kind of hang out at your residence?
There's always something. I'm always looking over my shoulder.
Yeah.
Even now, just talking about them, I have a bit of a chill
Aww.
down my spine. I'm in second floor, my writing space, and I've only got the light of a small desk lamp on, and I'm getting a chill just thinking about some of these stories.
Well, it sounds like you're extremely sensitive. So would you say you're very psychic or no?
I have never encountered what I believe to be a paranormal activity. I've never seen a ghost, but I believe that they're there, and it's possible that I may have seen or encountered something, but just not even realized what it was. I think I'm sensitive in the fact that, like I said, I'm a gigantic chicken. So when I hear a strange noise, I always assume it's something eerie. Right. When I was a kid growing up and I would hear something in the woods, I would assume it was Bigfoot rather than a bear. So I was always speculating that it was something paranormal or something supernatural. Not that I'd ever seen that, but I was always looking or on the lookout for something like that. So, and it's interesting because I've gone to on a lot of these tours, and I'm actually afraid that I might see something. Because I honestly think I would probably have a heart attack and die.
No, cancel that to the universe. But it reminds me of that movie, The Ghost of Mr. Chicken. You remember that one?
I haven't seen that one.
Oh,
no,
you're kidding. It's old. You have to check it out if you're into any kind of old movies. Yeah. It's anyway, it's this guy's scared of ghosts, but he encounters these pseudo ghosts. But yeah, it's a long story. I won't tell you on air, but yeah, you might want to check it out. I don't want you to spook yourself. That's for sure.
I won't watch it at night.
Yeah, that's right. Watch it in the daytime for sure. But when I look back at these mines, and I'm not trying to derail into the mines, but I do want to talk about that for a little bit. But they were mining nickel and copper, right?
That's right.
Okay, so I'm thinking to myself, the copper is a conductor, and I'm trying to find a scientific explanation for some of the anomalies. Do you think that it ties in at all? Is there anything that blends in?
Yeah, and that's something I talk about a little bit in Spooky Sudbury is that, and so for two things, Sudbury is also known as a hotbed for UFO activity. And one of the potential reasons that, and I'll take the first side of the fence first, is that extraterrestrial life may be interested in an area like Sudbury because the ground is rich in nickel, and nickel is an important element for creating metals and things like that. Therefore, it would be something that aliens would probably be attracted to. It's also, Sudbury's very rich in water, and that could be another thing because water produces life, so therefore that's another reason why they would be attracted to it. But the other theory that I've uncovered is that the high element of nickel or copper in the ground, and nickel and copper do exist very commonly in the same areas where there's a high concentration of nickel, you will find a lot of copper as well. That could have an effect on the mind and on the brain, and that could be what causes people to see things. That there could be a reaction to that. Sometimes maybe the lights that we're seeing in Sudbury could be a reflection of the high degree of nickel. And again, I'm not a scientist. I was just probably not properly relaying the reasoning as to why that would cause the mind to behave that way. But we do know, and it is something that I studied in Spooky Sudbury, because Laurentian University in Sudbury, there's a chapter about the God helmet. Dr. Michael Persinger from Laurentian University was able to use small degrees of electrical stimulation on the brain to trigger one of two possible responses, and that is that if the person is a religious person, when you trigger certain parts of their brain with a very minor electrical impulse, no more than something that you would feel from a hairdryer, for example, that people who are believers, are religious, will see angels.
Mm-hmm.
And those people who are more prone to fear of the devil will see demons. And that those who believe in extraterrestrial life and are, believers in UFOs will see aliens. And so it's interesting to see that, it's partially a combination of what we are more apt to believe in ourselves, combined with an element coming from an external source like electricity that is applied to certain areas of the brain.
Right. Yeah, I've looked into the God helmet, and that's spot on if you ask me. And, I consider us to be multidimensional beings, so it makes perfect sense that we're accessing some part of our higher self oversoul where we manifest at will our own reality. So that just makes so much sense to me. I'd like to try that God helmet.
Yeah, you know what? I never had the chance. Jenny interviewed Michael for that. I never had a chance to go and check it out.
Mm-hmm.
But then the thought, of course, of going into the dark room and putting the helmet on, and I'm a little bit nervous about what I might see.
That's funny. Well, yeah, you can overcome your fear if you just go in and put it on. But yeah, it sounds fascinating to me. I'd like to check that out. And yeah, very, very interesting stuff here for sure. And when you talk about the UFO encounters, is there a military base close by?
There's not,
Okay.
but there was. I have to talk about the military in Sudbury. And it was 1976. And there were so many, when I did the research, there were so many from the Sudbury Star, which is the newspaper from Sudbury, from the archives. There was almost not a month that went by without 2 or 3 reports of UFO activity in the sky from the 50s all the way through to the 80s. And it was startling. But in 1976, there were 3 independent police force confirmations of these lights seen above the Creighton mine. And there was a radar base there. Not a military base, but there was a radar. And I think it was probably out of Cold War fears about the Russians coming and invading, because this is a nickel-rich area.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so feared, probably because there was the belief that the Russians were coming to take over, that they sent 3 fighter pilots from the U.S. From probably not too far from where you are, and they sent them up, and they basically met in Sudbury, and when they got here, there was nothing. They couldn't find evidence that there was anything that had caused those those lights to show on the radar.
Mm-hmm.
And the two different police force reports plus the radar was what triggered it, because there were kind of like 3 independent reports. And it's funny when I talk to people about that. This was 1976, so I was quite young at the time, so I don't remember that. But when I talk to people who are older who were around, they go, "Oh yeah, I remember that.
Mm-hmm.
That was a major." That was a major deal, that there were U.S. Air Force fighter pilots scrambling over this city of 70,000 people on Sudbury. That was a pretty major deal for us.
Oh, no kidding. And did they ever give a real description of these UFOs?
I had uncovered some documents. There were pages and pages of the reports from the pilots, many of them with lots of pieces blacked out. But yeah, it kind of, when you read between the lines, or when you're actually reading the report, the pilots basically admitted that they had been told that there were things there, but by the time they got to Sudbury, there was nothing, and they scanned the skies. They couldn't find evidence that there had ever been anything there. So the real question is what could have caused the eyewitness plus the radar to report these lights in the sky, or these objects in the sky, and why couldn't the Air Force find them? Like, how could they get away that quickly?
Mm-hmm, exactly. Very mysterious, without a doubt. And there's also tales of UFOs actually chasing people. Is that correct?
Yeah. So
That's wild.
And that's really eerie. If you've ever driven on a deserted highway in the area. There's a highway, Highway 144, and growing up, I was always a little bit leery about being on that highway. There's just this weird impression that you're driving down the middle of the highway. All you have is the lights of your headlights ahead of you. Maybe you've got the tail lights, lighting up the road behind you a little bit, and you can barely see this dark wall of forest on either side of the highway. And the concept of actually, and this actually happened to a few different people, where they were driving down Highway 144, and these lights appeared coming up behind the hill behind them, and they thought, oh, okay, it's just a car coming over the hill. Mm-hmm. And of course, the lights just kept going up high in the sky, and were over top of the car, and were seeming to chase the car. And you've actually had drivers who were driving as fast as they could and couldn't get away from the lights that were chasing them, which is kind of an eerie thing to think about when you're out there on the highway all by yourself, and you've got this glowing ball in the sky that's chasing after you.
Oh yeah. Were there any tales of abductions or anything like that, or is it just the anomalies chasing them down?
There was only one story that I encountered where a man had actually claimed not to be abducted, but to have actually seen an alien that was speaking to him and basically communicating with him telepathically. So from all of the reports, most of the reports were lights in the sky, strange shapes in the sky, seen in different areas at different times. There was only one actual alien encounter story that I had uncovered in Sudbury. So that was kind of interesting. Lots of lights, lots of strange objects, lots of unexplained phenomena in the sky. Only one alien report.
Wow. Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, it sounds like a real hot spot for a lot of different activity.
Yeah, that was a big surprise for me. When I wrote Spooky Sudbury, I thought, oh, okay, I know there's been some UFO stuff, so we'll do a chapter on UFOs, and I ended up, there were 3 or 4 long chapters on UFOs, because when I started to uncover them, I went, oh my God, there's pages and pages. And I couldn't get into detail about each one, because that would have been a whole book. Mm-hmm. And so that was something that really shocked me when I was putting the book together.
Well, and it seems to me like this all kind of dovetails. I mean, the paranormal, ghost spirits, UFOs, it strikes me as interdimensional, multidimensional, all different types of energies connecting or interconnecting on different levels. What's your impression of that?
I think, when I look at it, and I'll give you an example. With Haunted Hamilton, I focus specifically on ghosts and haunted places. Mm-hmm. And it was Spooky Sudbury. One of the reasons, besides alliteration, that we went with spooky, is that we wanted to look at phenomenon, not just ghosts, but paranormal phenomenon. And I think that when you approach the universe with an open mind, we recognize there's a lot more to the world than most of us see. There's the things that we can see. There's the things that we can sense, and the world that we operate in is a certain way. But there's also things going on that sometimes you just catch a hint of. And the reality from my own perspective is we don't really know what it is. So, is it a ghost, or is it some other phenomenon that is beyond the world that we know? Mm-hmm. And so that's why with Spooky Sudbury, there are ghost stories, and there's stories about cryptid creatures that were, seen in lakes and things like that, but also lights in the sky. Mm-hmm. And I like to, when I look at that, I really like to look at the phenomenon of the things beyond this world. Or the things beyond our normal comprehension. Just calling that phenomenon a ghost or a spirit may be limiting yourself or narrowing your perspective to make assumptions on what something is. Mm-hmm.
I totally agree with that. Yeah, there's so many different spaces of energy where we can, some people just don't tune in, but it's fascinating. What a fascinating read. And also, your books are on Amazon.com, right?
Yep.
And also, are they sold on your website as well?
I don't sell them directly through my website. I'm happy to, if people want personally signed copies, I'm happy to do that for them. But I prefer, buy it at a bookstore, buy it from Amazon. That's that's local bookstores have my books as well. They're available pretty much through. They should be available through any major bookstore.
Mhm.
So, I mean, in the U.S., for example, Barnes and Noble's probably not going to stock these books, Haunted Hamilton or Spooky Sudbury, because they're a local interest. So they're probably not going to be stocked too far outside of the cities that they're set in. But I know that virtually any bookstore can order them. Amazon, of course, has them. And, Barnes and Noble or another chain could potentially order them in.
Oh, yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, for sure. I suggest everybody picks it up. It's interesting. It's a great read for late night. When you want to get scared.
I'm already
or creep
scared just
yourself
talking
out.
about it.
Oh, no, you're not. You're safe, really. It's funny, when I think about these orbs, I talked a little bit about the orbs that I'm really kind of interested in, but have you noticed orbs connecting in around those abandoned mines?
Oh, you mean like the orbs that are captured in photography? Or?
Right, yeah, those also, and also orbs of light or anything,
Yeah.
plasma-based orbs.
Yeah, that's something that's really, really interesting. I mean, there was the Bell Mansion, which is in Sudbury, which was a historically significant mansion. The Bell family was a rich family that had donated a lot of land to the city of Sudbury, and were very important. And the Bell Mansion became a museum in Sudbury. And Catherine Bell, her ghost is said to have joined in singing alongside other staff members when they're there, and sometimes you could hear her shuffling feet upstairs when you were downstairs by yourself. But the Bell Mansion grounds, there are pictures that were submitted to us from a photographer who was trying to figure out where these orbs came from, because it was a clear night, there was no moisture in the air, and yet two of the photographs he took had these strange orbs on them. And the concept of an orb is the camera picking up something that the human eye isn't able to detect.
Mm-hmm.
I really am not sure. What's your theory on the orbs?
Well, I think that they're definitely some kind of a spiritual design of. I mean, I can't say they're ghosts or not, but I do think they're based on consciousness. And I've heard of people actually summoning mentally or spiritually these types of spirits, and then they show up with these orbs. So I suspect they have something to do with the psychic energy of the person trying to establish communication. And
So they could be okay. So the person themselves is
kind of like
responsible for the
right.
generation. Okay.
Yeah, well, that's part of the manifestation. Now, I'm not saying that's all the time, but I have seen that where people go in and they want to take pictures of orbs, and you'll go in and just take a picture and nothing shows up, and then someone will go in and start summoning or talking to the spirit world, and then all of a sudden these orbs appear. So there's some kind of reciprocation going on between the different dimensions. That's my impression, anyway.
That's interesting. So that person has the ability to call them up.
Oh yeah, and I can send you pictures of that. I mean, it's phenomenal. I've never seen anything like it.
That's interesting. I mean, it's also and John Robert Colombo, who's a Canadian writer, he's called the Master Gatherer, and he wrote the introduction for my forthcoming book, Tomes of Terror. He talks about the fact that buildings aren't haunted, people are haunted,
right?
And that ghosts are associated with people more than they are with objects or places. And I thought that's very, very fascinating. Mm-hmm. It's almost like your spirit is tied to another spirit somewhere.
Right, and it's also, it reminds me of ancestors, too, where we are connecting with our ancestry, and sometimes that lineage has some sort of a personal haunt associated. That's also my impression, but I do think certain areas with a history, like we were talking about battlefields and things like that, have a unique signature that would create a haunting or something that would appear as a haunting, for sure.
Like a psychic impression on time and space or something like that.
Yeah, and the illusion of time, right? And it's almost like they're time travelers when you start piercing those veils and then they start appearing. Now, I don't know, have you actually, not you yourself, but have you documented or have people documented real-time apparitions that look like they're from another time period?
Yeah, actually it's funny because I'm working on Tomes of Terror right now, and I'm writing about haunted libraries and bookstores. Mm-hmm. One of the chapters I was working on last night involves people seeing an apparition dressed in clothes that are not from this era. And there's even in Haunted Hamilton, there was the ghost that they saw in the theater And he was wearing like the top hat, the Victorian dress, the whole bit, and it was really really funny because when the staff were shown a picture of Ambrose, they said, "Ha, very very funny. Where'd you get that picture from?" Because that was a picture of the man they kept seeing an apparition of in the haunted theater.
Is that the Sidney
Yeah.
Brown?
No, Sidney Brown's haunted theater in Spooky Suburbs.
Oh,
Sorry,
okay, that's right. Okay.
Sidney was the actor who had died before he got his chance on stage, and so he continually struts the boards
Wow.
afterwards. This was, pardon me. This was the. I have to go back to it. It's there was a man who disappeared from the Tivoli Theater in Hamilton, and it was quite a bit of a mystery because he just disappeared one day, and nobody ever found him. And there was a belief that his body was buried in the theater, and it was. I'm trying to remember his full name. What did I call him? Sorry, Ambrose Small. I might have called him Ambrose Pierce. My apologies. Ambrose Small, and he had disappeared. And it was his ghost that the staff seemed to have continued to see. And there was also I think the theater, in the Tivoli as well in Hamilton, there was a woman that was seen in the audience from a 1920s style dress, and this was seen in the 80s. So, and that's usually what makes people think, okay, I'm looking at something that's not from this era. I'm looking at somebody from a long time ago. And that happened at the Hamilton Armories as well, where there's been visions of soldiers from a long time ago, in dress that is not the dress that military folks wear today.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I've been to certain battlefields where I've actually heard and observed quite a bit psychically. So, yeah, I'm a firm believer in that. And it's interesting. Do you think some of these hauntings are considered to be benign? I mean, it doesn't seem like people have had negative encounters.
Yeah, because I mean, in a lot of ways, it's not like these are, I would just say poltergeists, or these are not spirits that are there to do harm. These are just either psychic impressions on time and space that are continually, when you think of it as a film that just keep replaying over and over. In some cases, they're benign, and in some cases, there's a sadness to them. There's a really great story from Haunted Hamilton about the ruins in Ancaster, and it was a beautiful, stately mansion at one time that this woman was very, very proud of. And when it burnt to the ground, she stayed in a tent on the grounds. She could not leave the building. And when she died, shortly after she died, her ghost was seen on the grounds. And one of the most beautiful stories was so in Ancaster, it's about a 15-minute hike off of the main roads to get to where the ruins stand. And there's these beautiful partial walls still standing from the original mansion. And there was a story about one afternoon an architecture student who was coming up to look at this historically significant site. And he rounded the corner and he looks up at the building, and instead of seeing the ruins, he sees a beautiful, stately mansion. It's made from stone and wood, and it looks as if it had just been built, and it was gorgeous. And then he sees this woman standing in the field, and she's looking at him, looking at that, and she smiles, and then both her and the building fade, and she's gone, and all he sees is the ruins. And I thought that was such a touching thing because you could tell that it was her wanting someone else to recognize the beauty that she saw there. And that was why after the mansion had burned and that was all that was left, she saw it that way, and she was so happy to have somebody else see what she saw. It's kind of like, my baby is beautiful. I want everyone to see my baby is beautiful. And it was that sort of thing. And when I read a story about like that. I just thought that was so touching, so wonderful.
Hmm.
And so, and that was Alma Dick Lauder, who is the name of the woman who was the ghost in that story. But what I thought was the most fascinating is that prior to her death and prior to becoming a ghost, whose the stories about her were shared about the Hermitage ruins, she used to be a writer of Hamilton history, and she often reflected on the ghosts and the sadness when people let buildings go and suffer under the ravages of time. And so I thought it was interesting because I was reading her book from 100 years earlier, and I quoted from her book in a couple other articles when she was talking about other allegedly haunted places, and I thought it was so fascinating that she wrote about the ghosts and then became a ghost later in the story. So
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, it's interesting when you start documenting the history of things, and then of course then there's that signature, that psychic imprint that's been left behind along with the history. It's fascinating. It really is. It's a science on its own, you know.
oh, definitely.
Yeah, it's just really amazing, and I love the way you present this information. You're a great storyteller too, by the way.
Thank you
I'm
very
sure
much.
everybody's enjoying this. I know I am, and yeah, we're not scared quite yet, but
No, so I'm trying to do the touching story so I can feel heartwarmed as well.
oh, good, yay! It's interesting. What's your take on the afterlife, and why do you think the hauntings occur in general? You think it's just based on trauma, or is there something else happening?
It could be trauma. It could be unresolved. It could be a psychic impression of something important that happened. I actually have a theory, and there's a short story of mine that I wrote that was sort of based on the theory, is that you don't have to die to leave your spirit in a place. Then the short story was called Spirits, and the whole concept of the story was exploring the idea that you could be so tied to someone or something that you could leave your spirit there, that there was such an important thing to you that you moved on, your body moved on, and you're off doing things in the normal universe, but your spirit is still there at that important moment. And maybe it's where you met someone or where something really significant happened. And so I believe that there are spirits. I believe that you can be tied to a place or a person or a thing. I don't believe you have to have died in order to leave your spirit behind. I believe there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophies. So I think there are a lot more things than we can truly properly understand. I mean, you remember that, I've never seen an atom, but I believe they exist. There's been scientific documentation of it, but there's also been documentation throughout various cultures around the world about spiritual presences. Whether whatever religion you believe or do not believe in, whether you believe in the afterlife or not, the phenomenon of paranormal activities or orbs or spirits or whatever, it seems to be pretty consistent mythology across culture, across religion.
Yep, indeed it is. And you're right about the attachment. That makes it makes perfect sense to me. And also the attachment to, what you were saying, people, but also possessions and the illusion of possessions. I suspect that people might be attached to certain objects and things like that, which could leave a psychic imprint. But it's all very fascinating.
Yeah, well, I had a lot of fun with the objects. One of the sort of the dark humor horror stories I wrote was a story about a man who, and a fiction, of course, who collects haunted artifacts. It was called Requiem. And I thought, imagine an object is haunted. So he gets a sword, and the sword is haunted by a pirate who owned the sword. And there's a crib, and it's haunted by the baby who died in that crib. And there's a dresser that's haunted by the woman, the Victorian woman who used to do her makeup in the mirror for the dresser. And imagine he collects all of these haunted artifacts and puts them all in the same room. Well, And I'm not sure if you have brothers or sisters, but when you take a whole bunch of people and you force them into the back of a car for a long trip, they're going to bicker and they're going to fight. Mm-hmm. And so my thought for this story was, what if this collector of haunted artifacts takes all of these haunted artifacts and puts them all in this museum room of his house? And what if the ghosts don't get along? Mm-hmm. Because they're from different time periods, they're different personalities, and so the whole concept of it was, how could he collect them for so long without realizing that they're actually ghosts? Like, he collects them because they're haunted, but he's never seen the ghosts. Mm-hmm. What could cause him to suddenly start to see the ghosts and then to realize what he has done is thrown all of these ghosts together? So it's sort of dark humor, but it's also a little bit creepy. Mm-hmm. And that was a really, really fun story to explore, because I like to ask those sorts of questions.
Oh, I love it. Yeah. And we're headed for a break. We'll be right back at Ravenstar's Witching Hour. Stay tuned, everybody. My special guest, Mark Leslie.